A mother and daughter vanished into thin air. Years later, their remains were found in two different states, separated by nearly 700 miles. But the real shock? Someone had been impersonating the mother, even talking to police. And the monster behind it all? You won't believe what he did. This is the heartbreaking case of Karlie Pearce Stevenson and her daughter Khandalyce, a story of deception, horror, and ultimate justice. Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Do you think justice was truly served in this case? Make sure you watch the whole video and drop a comment. Your thoughts might be featured in our next video. Karlie Pearce Stevenson had spent her entire life in Alice Springs in the Northern Territory of Australia. The small town is extremely remote and sits in the dead center of the continent, in what is referred to as the Red Center, the country's interior desert. Alice Springs is the midpoint between the larger cities of Darwin to the north and Adelaide to the south, both of which are more than a 15-hour drive through vast expanses of barren red desert. Karlie enjoyed life in Alice Springs, but the 20-year-old longed for a larger city with more opportunities where she could raise her 2-year-old daughter, Khandalyce. Karlie's mother, family, and friends were sad to see her go, but they knew it was what she wanted to do. They were skeptical, however, of who she chose to leave town with. Karlie's new boyfriend, Daniel Holdom, was 15 years older than Karlie, and her family really didn't know much about the man. But Karlie was determined. In mid-2008, without any long goodbyes, Karlie, Khandalyce, and Holdom left the small town to find a new life. Did you ever have a gut feeling about someone in your life that everyone else ignored? Let us know in the comments if you've ever trusted the wrong person. Initially, Karlie called and texted her friends and family on a regular basis, often expressing her regret about leaving the small town. But by the summer of 2009, Karlie's communications had mysteriously stopped. All calls or text messages suddenly went unanswered, and after several months of not hearing from her daughter, Karlie's mother, Colleen Povey, called the police. On September 4th, she filed a missing person report with the Northern Territory Police. Here is a photo of Karlie and Khandalyce Pearce Stevenson and Daniel Holdom. Karlie was an adult and could do what she pleased, but police took the investigation seriously and did their best to locate Karlie and Khandalyce. Investigators checked Karlie's banking records and could see that the account was still active and used regularly. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. They also saw that her welfare payments issued by Centrelink were still being cashed. There was also a record that she had been pulled over by police for speeding on the Stewart Highway, north of Adelaide, in November 2008. But almost a year had passed since then. Isn't it strange how a person can vanish in the age of digital footprints? Tell us, do you think the police should have dug deeper at this point? Still looking for further proof of life, detectives contacted the person that was last seen with Karlie and Khandalyce, Daniel Holdom. Investigators located and called Holdom, who assured them that Karlie was very much alive and well. He passed the phone to Karlie, who spoke to investigators and reassured them, "I'm fine. I just don't want to speak to my family anymore." With that, investigators were satisfied that Karlie was indeed alive, but just in need of her privacy. They relayed the news to her mother. Colleen was sad and confused that her daughter didn't want to speak to her family or friends any longer. But at the same time, she was relieved that Karlie and Khandalyce were alive. What none of them knew, however, was that the woman that had spoken to investigators was not Karlie. Chills. Imagine someone calling you, and it's not who you think it is. Would you have known? In August 2010, two young men riding dirt bikes through the bushland of the Belangelo State Forest, almost 1,800 miles from Alice Springs near Sydney, came across a gruesome discovery: human bones making up an entire female skeleton. Nearby, investigators found pieces of jewelry, a sock, and a printed t-shirt with the word angelic written on it. Initially, there was speculation that the body may have been a victim of Ivan Milat, the serial killer who had murdered young women throughout Australia from 1989 to 1993. However, forensic examination of the skeleton determined that this murder was much more recent and had most likely taken place within the past 2 years. Using the structure of the skull, forensic anthropologists were able to put together a composite drawing of what the victim may have looked like. They released it to the public along with photos of the t-shirt. The evidence, however, didn't seem to match any active missing person reports. No one came forward to say the girl looked familiar. With no clues, the case went cold. For the next 5 years, the police and media referred to the mysterious girl as Angel. Angel became a name known across Australia, but behind that word was a heartbreaking truth. Comment, "Rest in peace, Angel," to honor her memory. Here is the composite drawing of the victim, angelic t-shirt design. Several years had passed since anyone had had contact with Karlie Pearce Stevenson when her mother suddenly got a text message. The message came from Karlie's cell phone, and Colleen had no reason to believe it wasn't her. Karlie wanted her mother to know that she was okay, but she and Khandalyce needed money. Colleen was eager to help her daughter and quickly wired her $500. The same request came several more times over the next year, and each time she wired more money. This part hurts the most. A mother dying of cancer, still clinging to hope. Have you ever held on to hope when everything said not to? Let us know. Colleen Povey was suffering from breast cancer and pleaded with her daughter to come back home to visit. Each time, Karlie promised she would come home. Unfortunately, Colleen died in 2012 without ever knowing the true fate of her daughter and granddaughter. On July 14, 2015, 5 years after the skeleton was found in the Belangelo State Forest, a man traveling on a remote highway east of Adelaide discovered an abandoned suitcase along the side of the road. When he pulled over to get a closer look, he found a small quilt and young child's clothes inside. Nearby, further off the side of the road and behind a tree, he found more children's clothing. A pink dress, a fur-trimmed coat, a tiny black tutu, and a tiny Dora the Explorer shirt. When the man looked closer at the clothes inside the suitcase, he got the shock of his life. Poking through the fabric was a jawbone. As he dug deeper through the clothes, he found a tiny human skeleton laying in the fetal position. From the size of the bones, investigators determined that the victim was female and approximately 2 to 4 years old. It was impossible to believe that a toddler of that age had disappeared without anyone noticing, but the tiny girl matched no missing person reports. 5 years had passed since the body in the Belangelo State Forest was found. The toddler in the suitcase was found 680 miles away from the first body in a different state. It was no wonder that law enforcement hadn't linked the two cases. Authorities wouldn't release the official cause of death of the toddler, instead opting to only tell the media that the young girl found in the suitcase had died a violent death under terrible circumstances. Again, investigators reached out to the public to help identify the girl. The only clues that they had available were the Lanza brand suitcase and the clothes found inside the suitcase. The brands of the clothing were mostly mass-produced and sold in Kmart stores throughout Australia. However, one item in the suitcase, the small quilt, appeared to be handmade. South Australia police held a televised press conference where they dressed a tiny mannequin in clothing identical to that found in the suitcase and displayed the same brand of suitcase in which the body was found. They also released photos of each piece of clothing and the handmade quilt, then set up a hotline for tips. The death of the toddler was heart-wrenching, and the news reached all across Australia. Here are some pictures of the clothes found at scene. A mannequin and suitcase being shown at press conference. Immediately, the tips poured in from the nearby tiny town of Winarka. Although the town had only 75 residents, 15 of them called to say they had seen a Caucasian man in his 60s wheeling a similar suitcase through town 3 months earlier in late April. More than 1,000 calls poured in to the Crime Stoppers hotline throughout August and September, but it wasn't until October that police got their first useful tip. A woman from Adelaide, more than 80 miles from where the body was found, recognized the pink dress that had been found in the suitcase. Incredibly, the woman had met Karlie and Khandalyce in a shopping mall in Adelaide and taken a photo of Khandalyce wearing an identical pink dress. The meeting, however, had taken place 7 years earlier, in November 2008. Tanya Weber had been a friend of Karlie's back in Alice Springs and had heard the news of the toddler's body being found. Fearing the worst, she rummaged through boxes of old photos until she found a photo of Khandalyce in her stroller. In the photo, behind Khandalyce's head, was the same handmade quilt she had seen on the news. When Khandalyce was born, she had been given a neonatal heel prick in order to take a blood sample. DNA from the skeletal remains were compared to the blood taken during the heel prick, and it was a match. The body in the suitcase was positively identified as khandalyce. DNA doesn't lie. But why did it take this long? Do you think every missing persons case include national DNA testing from the start? Let us know in the comments. Anyway, a national DNA search using khandalyce's DNA matched her mother's remains. Karlie Pearce Stevenson was positively identified as the body found in Belangelo State Forest. Detectives now knew that Karlie and Khandalyce had been murdered and had most likely already been dead when they were first reported missing 6 years earlier. Two questions remained, however. Who killed them, and who had detectives spoken to on the phone years earlier that had claimed to be Karlie? Detectives began their investigation by attempting to retrace Karlie's steps since she first left Alice Springs. They knew that she had driven from one end of the continent to the other and had to have stayed in motels or campgrounds along the way. Investigators reached out to any campgrounds, landlords, or motel operators who might have remembered the young girl traveling with her daughter and an older man, but none reached out. They also needed to speak with the man with whom Karlie had left Alice Springs, Daniel Holdom. 41-year-old Holdom was the obvious suspect and wasn't hard to find. It was an ominous premonition of things to come when detectives discovered he was already in jail for sexually assaulting a young girl in a campground. Having Holdom in custody, however, gave investigators time to look closely into his background. Daniel Holdom had a long history of drug addiction and abuse of women and children. His records showed that he had sexually assaulted an 8-year-old girl and had attempted to strangle a woman. He was also accused of stalking another. Search warrants were issued for several homes across Australia, where Holdom had lived throughout the years. It didn't take long for investigators to know they had the killer. In one of his homes where he lived in Canberra, they found a diary written in Holdom's handwriting where he fantasized about sexually abusing children. In the diary, he used specific children's names and ages as he detailed his sadistic desires. Words such as rape and forced were peppered throughout. His fingerprints were all over the diary. Police also learned that just months before Daniel Holdom met Karlie, he was involved in a fatal car accident. Holdom was driving through the interior desert of Central Australia with his then-girlfriend Hazel Passmore and her 2 young children. When he swerved to avoid a kangaroo in the road, the SUV rolled several times. The crash left her 2 children, 7-year-old Ryan and 9-year-old Willow, dead. Hazel Passmore lost her leg above the knee and was confined to a wheelchair for the rest of her life. Holdom escaped unharmed. After the incident, Passmore sued Holdom for negligence, seeking unspecified damages for her losses. While Hazel Passmore spent months in the hospital and rehab, Holdom began his relationship with Karlie. Detectives soon learned, however, that just after Karlie and Khandalyce went missing, Holdom and Passmore had reconciled. Investigators served a search warrant on the home of Hazel Passmore and questioned her. During her initial interview, she gave very little detail of her relationship with Daniel Holdom and denied any involvement in the murders. Passmore, however, had uploaded photos from a classic car show onto her Facebook timeline. In the forefront of the photos, Khandalyce Pearce Stevenson could be seen walking around the cars. The photos, however, were taken in Alice Springs, just before Karlie and Khandalyce had left town. Here's some photos of Khandalyce from Hazel Passmore's Facebook page /Hazel Passmore. When questioned a second time by investigators, Passmore hired a lawyer. She and her lawyer agreed to a deal with prosecutors. She would tell them what she knew in an induced statement, meaning she couldn't be prosecuted for any involvement in the case. Knowing she was immune from prosecution, Hazel Passmore told police that Daniel Holdom had admitted to her that he had killed Karlie and Khandalyce. She initially didn't believe him and thought he was just joking, so she didn't report the murders to the police. Passmore also admitted that she was the woman that spoke to investigators and claimed to be Karlie. She had been the one that had been accessing Karlie's bank accounts and had even gone into the Centrelink offices in her wheelchair, posing as Karlie. Through the years, the couple had withdrawn almost $100,000 from Karlie's accounts. Passmore explained that she had no idea that Karlie and Khandalyce were dead. She thought that she and Holdom were simply having an affair behind Karlie's back. It wasn't until she discovered Karlie's Medicaid card and Khandalyce's birth certificate that she had realized what he had done and confronted him about it. "I was yelling and screaming, 'What the fuck is this shit?' I was going off my nut and he pulled me inside, literally by the scruff of the neck. He threw the chair and he starts shaking me and he's like, "She's disappeared, she's gone, she's gone." And I'm like, "What do you mean she's gone?" And he's like, "She's dead, she's dead." Passmore also provided telling insight into Holdom's sexual preferences. She said that he had shown an interest in child abuse and bestiality websites, and often asked her to recount her own child abuse to him. He also liked to write his own rape stories. Hazel Passmore had given a memory card to her sister years earlier and told her, "If anything happens to me, you need to give this to police." When police searched the memory card, they found photos from the Belangelo State Forest that Hazel had copied from Daniel Holdom's computer. The horrific photos showed Karlie Pearce Stevenson at the time of her death, clearly showing the angelic t-shirt she had been wearing. Some of the photos also showed Daniel Holdom's arm in the periphery, putting him at the scene of the crime. The photos had shown that Holdom had sexually abused Karlie using a bottle before her death. He finally killed her by stepping on her throat, crushing her trachea. Holdom had taken photos as he raped and murdered Karlie and kept them on his computer as trophies. This case isn't just about murder. It's about power, control, and deception. Do you believe evil like this is born or made? Drop your thoughts. Before he murdered Karlie, Holdom had dropped Khandalyce off with his relatives. Afterward, he picked her up and told his relatives he was driving the girl to her grandmother's home. Instead, he drove 4 hours west to the small town of Narandera, where he purchased duct tape and dishcloths at a supermarket during the journey. Police recovered a motel receipt where he had signed in as one adult and one child. Detectives believe he had stuffed dishcloths into her mouth and duct taped her mouth shut before suffocating khandalyce in the Narandera motel. He then stuffed her tiny body into the suitcase and drove another 8 hours west toward Hazel Passmore's home. Before he reached his destination, Holdom tossed the suitcase on the side of the road near the remote town of Winarka, where it sat untouched for more than 5 years. Daniel Holdom's cell phone records had shown his location all along the way, placing him in Belangelo State Forest at the time of Karlie's death and following to the exact location where he dumped the suitcase in Winarka. He was officially charged with the murders of Karlie and Khandalyce Pearce Stevenson on December 15, 2015. Holdom initially pleaded guilty to the 2 murders, then at the last minute tried to retract his guilty plea of Khandalyce's murder. The judge, however, denied his retraction, and on November 30, 2018, Daniel Holdom was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the chance of parole. Justice was served, but is it enough? Should Australia have harsher penalties for crimes this brutal? Hazel Passmore eventually received a $1 million settlement in her suit against Holdom for the car crash that killed her children and severed her left leg. This case is one of the darkest examples of how manipulation, deception, and evil can wear a mask for years. One of the biggest lessons we can take from Karlie's story is the importance of listening to our instincts and encouraging our loved ones to do the same. Karlie's family had doubts about Daniel Holdom from the beginning. Sometimes your gut speaks before the truth comes out. Don't ignore it. Another painful lesson lies in the cracks of the system. Authorities spoke to a woman they believed was Karlie, but it wasn't her. They closed the case, and for years, no one knew 2 innocent lives had already been taken. This reminds us that even institutions can get it wrong. It's why persistence matters. If someone you love goes missing, keep pushing, keep asking, keep searching. Colleen, Karlie's mother, showed unconditional love. Even while battling cancer, she never gave up on her daughter. She held on to hope, sending money, waiting for her return. Her story reminds us of the deep sacrifice and strength of a parent's love. But it also teaches that blind trust can be exploited by monsters. Love wisely, protectively, but don't be afraid to ask the hard questions. Lastly, this case sheds light on the unspoken violence women and children face behind closed doors. Abuse is often silent before it screams. If you or someone you know is in a toxic or dangerous situation, speak up, ask for help. You are not alone. You matter. And silence should never be the price of survival. May Karlie and Khandalyce rest in peace, and may their story be a wake-up call to always fight for the truth, even when it's painful.